The most powerful node on the proof of weapons network currently today is BlackRock. Under the Biden administration, I think the US decided that they wanted to co opt the network. And this time isn't to take it down, it is to try and get your Bitcoin and hold it through Wall Street rather than you owning it direct in self custody. I've been in Bitcoin. I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference in 2011. And in 2011, it was us versus the banks.
I want to focus in on BlackRock specifically because I think BlackRock plays a major entity in all of this. And so I'm curious, explain your theory on BlackRock and how they could be potentially trying to take over this whole Bitcoin space.
Yeah, sure. So look, I've been in Bitcoin. I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference in 2011, and in 2011 it was us versus the banks, and we were creating money you can own, money you can spend, and money that has a fixed supply that would allow everyone to beat inflation and escape the network, boycott the network, as it were. So it was a bottom up movement. It was cypherpunks focused on privacy and activists that were focused on how to process transactions without the banks. Now because Bitcoin has a fixed supply, it obviously became the highest performing asset in history during those 14 years. And when I first got involved, the price of Bitcoin crashed from $30 to $3, and we had like a 90% correction there. And really, we went through this whole journey of adoption, which is that first they just kind of laughed at it. They didn't take it seriously. Then it started being used on some of the illicit markets. So then they started to try and tarnish its reputation. And then over time, they tried to create alternative versions. They tried to eliminate the word Bitcoin and replace it with blockchain. And then eventually, they executed what I consider to be a covert operation called, others, Nick Carter famously called it Operation Choke Point 2.0. But under the Biden administration, I think the US decided that they wanted to co opt the network and try and get as much Bitcoin as possible. And they did a multi layer attack. Now, let me be crystal clear. In my entire time in Bitcoin, we have been fighting attacks throughout the whole time, and we always win. It's an anti fragile network. But we have to bring attention to things as they become clear. And so we've always, we're at a stage right now where, Bitcoin doesn't really need like the positive PR, as it were, because Bitcoin has taken its own trajectory. However, there is definitely what I consider to be, financial weapons of mass destruction fired at Bitcoin. And this time isn't to take it down, it is to try and get your Bitcoin and hold it through Wall Street rather than you owning it direct in self custody. And that is happening on multi fronts. And so we can dig deeper into some of the financial weapons of mass destruction. But in my overarching theory, because Bitcoin created proof of work, which gave you the ability, to own your own Bitcoin and hold it in self custody. Excuse me. Um, because before I got involved in Bitcoin, I was involved in banking and monetary reform. I call it a proof of weapons network, and it uses multiple weapons in order to try and get as much Bitcoin under its control as possible, so that it can empower itself, the network. So where would you like me to start?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to definitely chew off there, but I want to get into the Wall Street's attack, right? You described it as the weapons of mass destruction, essentially coming at Bitcoin here, and I want to focus in on BlackRock specifically because I think, there's something I want to come back to about your two-tiered approach here in a minute, but I think BlackRock plays a major entity in all of this. And what I think is very interesting is that since these ETFs have come on, I think a lot of Bitcoiners, I've seen the massive amounts of buying. Of course, Bitcoin's going to win in the end, but ETFs overall have 1.5 million Bitcoin under their custody as it stands right now, and BlackRock's ETF has nearly 1 million coins itself. So I'm curious your role in theory of just BlackRock specifically, and then if you could expand out on the true financial markets of the other weapons of mass destruction that you see.
Yeah, sure. So the right way to think about this is every empire, particularly in the Western empires, they've always had like a private interest which represents the majority of control over resources and financialization. And so, under the if we look at the last two empires, you had the Dutch Empire, which kind of created central banking and capitalism as we know it today, and created the Dutch East India Company to take advantage of its shipmaking in order to use mercantilism and gain access to commodities, gold and various other commodities. Then they outsourced the shipmaking to the cheap labor, which was the Brits. And then the Brits copied much of the infrastructure, Bank of England, capitalism as we know it today, and created the British East India Company, and used the British East India Company in shipmaking in order to do colonial expeditions to steal as much gold and silver and real commodities as possible, to back its currency. Now, with the American empire, we have a neo version of that. It is not one organization, it is a network, as I said, a proof of weapons network. But power shifts dynamically. But the most powerful node on the proof of weapons network currently today is BlackRock. It is measured by both technology and how many assets it's managing. And so BlackRock is currently managing about $12 trillion of assets. And by owning those shares and access to passive pension money, insurance premiums, endowment investments, and all the access to capital flows, it gets regular income in order to purchase assets on behalf of its investors. But with those assets, it gets voting rights and board seats in those companies. And so essentially, you have this network, this one organization that has $12 trillion of assets under management. And it also has technology that pulls together all the vast data that only BlackRock has access to. And so you have Aladdin AI technology, which all of the money managers in the world use, as well as Treasury when managing, fiscal budgets, as well as the Federal Reserve when managing its bailouts. And so you've got this one organization that has influence over all the vast other money managers, its own money management, treasury budgets, and monetary policy as well. So it has consolidated significant power. It has shares in over 20,000 companies, and it installs its own board and voting rights. And so BlackRock is kind of the CEO of this network. There are other nodes like State Street, Vanguard, and then JP Morgan for financialization and securitization, various other things. Now, what it does is it manages its portfolio to prepare for any eventuality. I personally believe that it is managing a transition to weaken the dollar and transition to a multipolar world. And as part of that, many of the central banks are accumulating gold, pushing it to record highs. And also, it exerted a mission in order to take over aspects of the Bitcoin ecosystem, built a centralized Bitcoin industrial complex, like it has a financial industrial complex, and gain as much control over as many of the aspects of Bitcoin. It doesn't really care about crypto. It will do some Ethereum staking. That one's really easy because proof of stake means by owning the token, it's like a share, a voting right, you get control in the governance. But Bitcoin's a lot harder because it's proof of work. And so they are engineering, I believe, a strategy to centralize as much Bitcoin and control shares in as many of the companies that can centralize Bitcoin and many of the miners in America. So the multi financial weapons of mass destruction that it's constructing is Bitcoin treasury companies. So, when a company becomes as big as Strategy and has 650,000 Bitcoin, it eventually reaches a market cap where it's included in the S&P 500. Once it's included in the S&P 500, it has access to all the index funds managed by BlackRock. And so BlackRock will accumulate a the largest shareholding eventually in Strategy, and then it will be able to put in its board, and it will be able to exert influence to potentially get all of the different debt products, which are other companies in the network, to lend to Strategy, lever it up, and then turn it into a bank so that people can borrow against their Bitcoin. So other nodes in the network are like Cantor Fitzgerald. Cantor Fitzgerald is a primary dealer. It has access to the Federal Reserve quantitative easing budgets. It is also a buyer of last resort for bonds. It has now become the primary custodian for stablecoins and Tether's treasuries. And so through this mechanism, Tether holds buys treasuries every time it issues a stablecoin, and then the yield buys Bitcoin, and then it also invests in the Bitcoin mining industry. It also has the companies that US persuaded to mine in Texas. So we used to have a China centralization problem, but then we moved to an America centralization problem. And so when China decided to crack down on Bitcoin, they had approximately 60% of the hash power in China, and then that moved over to 20% in China, 40% in America, and much of that ended up with these companies that are now going public. And so we've now got multiple public companies that are essentially mining Bitcoin and putting it on their balance sheet, and also borrowing from Wall Street and borrowing against their stock price. So when you have all these public companies, and they have to borrow against their stock price, you create the ability for the Fed and all the different networks at some point to try and get people to lever their Bitcoin as well. And so JP Morgan, another node in the network, comes along and says, hey, why don't you borrow against your Bitcoin ETF? Give me your Bitcoin, or buy, rather than buy Bitcoin, buy our ETF, and then you can borrow against it, and we'll mine some dollars through the banking system in order to give you some dollar access. Now you are a debt slave. When you start taking leverage tied to equity and collateral, this is the perfect type of game that the Federal Reserve, the proof of weapons network, the banks, the financial institutions, let's call it the financial industrial complex, uses in order to create pump and dump schemes through their hedge funds. And then they use their own mutual funds in order to gain exposure. So, what they are doing right now is, because they can't control the long term price of Bitcoin because it's a digital scarce asset, they're going to be pushing out derivatives as well. So then they have other nodes in the network that say, let's create options, let's create futures, let's create perpetual futures, let's create 100x leverage. And so when you combine all of these forces together, as well as the Trump administration, regulatory capture, an environment of deregulation, which we're seeing right now, you basically have all the tools to try and get as many margin calls, centralize as much Bitcoin as possible, get board seats on many of the mining companies. And we as Bitcoiners need to resist against it. And as I said, it's an attack vector that we will win, but we win through what Bitcoin was designed for, not falling for the strategies, not levering up our Bitcoin, not buying a Bitcoin ETF instead of buying Bitcoin directly, not borrowing against our Bitcoin. Leverage is the tool, and Bitcoin is the boycott. So we combat the proof of weapons network through proof of work. And far too many in America are falling for it because the financial industrial complex is being built in America. And so we need to be aware of this attack vector, and we need to understand that as this gift of Bitcoin was given to us to boycott the system, have our own money, spend our own money, and beat all of the Wall Street mutual funds, all of the products that they create. Bitcoin has outperformed them all. That allows us to escape the network, build wealth, and then use that wealth in order to boycott the network. And we need to do our part by owning it in self custody, by running nodes.
What if I told you you never had to sell your Bitcoin? Instead, you can borrow against it with Salt Lending. Why give up your hard earned Bitcoin when you can unlock its value without letting it go? With Salt, you get secure Bitcoin collateralized loans with no credit checks, no prepayment fees, and best of all, no rehypothecation. Salt has had zero customer collateral losses since it launched. Salt was the first platform to offer Bitcoin collateralized loans starting way back in 2016. Today, they offer tailored options for both individuals and businesses. And now introducing Salt Shield, the no liquidation solution. No forced liquidations during the lifetime of your loan when you're enrolled with Salt Shield. This just launched at the Bitcoin conference in Las Vegas, and it is next level peace of mind. For Green Candle listeners only, head to saltlending.com/green-candle for this exclusive offer for your Bitcoin collateralized loan. You can get cash for your Bitcoin today. Salt Lending, secure, trusted, proven.
Boycott the network. And we need to do our part by owning it in self custody, by running nodes. And if all of us don't, if, there is in economics, we have a concept called tragedy of the commons. It simply means that, if everyone wants to use a road, but there's no way of making money out of a road, no one creates the road. And so you have to rely upon someone to create the road. And in this case, we have to, as Bitcoiners, make sure that we've got 71% of all Bitcoin right now in self custody, and we need to be aware of that matrix. And as that matrix gets closer and closer to BlackRock's goal, we need to understand the attack vector, and we need to prop up the network. So I want as many people to understand that there is a huge benefit in self custody. That is the freedom that comes with it. And if any of these institutions want to steal your Bitcoin, they will use leverage, and they want you to lever them up so that they can control them, they can use them, and they can create paper Bitcoin obligations and IOUs. We've seen this before throughout the entire history. The Mt. Gox exchange never took down Bitcoin, but it took a lot of people's Bitcoin. Bitfinex hack never took down Bitcoin, but it took a lot of people's Bitcoin. The Quadrica CX hack, or disappearance of the founders never took down Bitcoin, but it took a lot of people's Bitcoin. And so these centralized honeypots, we need to be aware of. And that's what the proof of weapons network is building.
Now, do you think that they're already, I guess, to a point where they can essentially control these different areas of Bitcoin? I mean, you mentioned a couple of the, Bitcoin miners, right? I mean, there's a couple big publicly traded Bitcoin mining companies already in the S&P 5 are already publicly traded. And then, BlackRock with their ETF already having, over 1 million coins. And then on top of it, they increased their stake in strategy, earlier this year to, I believe, over 5%, where they had to, do a full filing for it. And then, once strategy gets in that S&P 500 here, most likely in a month or maybe, sometime early next year, it seems like that's inevitable. So I guess which areas, or if is it all areas that BlackRock is essentially going to be able to control, whether it's the treasury companies or the mining or both?
Yeah, I believe that they will attempt to get as much power as they possibly can. Now, control is a loaded word. Bitcoin is virtually impossible to control. We've seen every type of attack vector. We saw the block war, when the miners and the VCs and the companies colluded with the developers, and they were in an internal struggle around what they wanted. The users had to fight back with a user activated soft fork. So we needed to run nodes, and then we needed to signal that we would, be able to combat whatever the miners wanted. So this is a spectrum, and there's never complete control because what is Bitcoin? It's open source code. So you have an attack vector there with the developers. Can you blackmail, co-opt, collude the developers? And that's why it's important to have these competing implementations. That kind of goes into some of the controversy that we've been experiencing as a community between knots and core. It's important to have these battles. These are all features, not bugs. The mining network we have to combat with private mining, sovereign mining. It's important for countries that hate each other to mine. Right now you've got Iran mining, Russia mining, China mining. America has the largest amount of hash power located in its country. But again, anything that goes public is Wall Street controlled. If you ever want to crash someone's share price, they have the ability to do it. And so they can push companies into Chapter 11 if they choose, and they can co-opt all the founders. by pushing them through their share price. And if they don't take on debt, which is their mechanism for control, then they push another company instead. So they have the ability to knock these public companies up and down. And Iron, for example, right now is working with Microsoft. They're changing some of their hash power to artificial intelligence. And so Microsoft and Iron are being good players to the proof of weapons network. So they get a 6x increase in their share price. Because remember, share has no reflection. There is no such concept of earnings per share anymore. It is just a function of the Federal Reserve. And who's the Federal Reserve shareholder? The banks. And so now all companies are priced not on their earnings, not on anything else other than their geopolitical usefulness to the proof of weapons network. That's why you get Nvidia as a $5 trillion company. You have these crazy, I mean, Palantir, like
Yeah.
valuations that have no concept of reality based upon government contracts that is trading at like 600 times earnings per share. None of the traditional mechanisms work anymore because the only way to have your share price pumped and to stay in the network is to bow down to the network. So it's geopolitical usefulness. And so I believe right now, because BlackRock and wants to move to a multipolar world, Bitcoin is a negotiation and leverage tool against other jurisdictions they don't control, like China, Russia, some of the Middle Eastern countries as well. So it is becoming a currency war and a political tool at the geopolitical level. So the most important thing in this, and this is the exciting of the world we're moving from the dollar being the global hegemon to multipolarity. And that is where Bitcoin was made for, at the sovereign level as well. So, does BlackRock have enough control right now? They are moving in the right direction. We need to be aware of the attack vector. But right now, they would need to co opt all of the developers, they would need to fool all of the users, they would need to accumulate all of the Bitcoin within ETFs, and they would need to own all the mining companies. They are miles away from that, but they are gaining more and more leverage. What does that give them? It gives them the ability to manipulate and influence in the direction they want to go. And then we need to be aware of the attack vectors so that we can plan our counterattack. And we will win. They're not going to co opt Bitcoin, but people just need to be aware of the attack vector, and recognize that Bitcoin, as the most decentralized supercomputer in the world, we have to do our part for that. But no, they're nowhere near enough being able to control the network, fork off the network, destroy the network in any way, shape, or form. But I bet you they're going to try.
Do you think that they're, I guess, far enough along in order to manipulate the Bitcoin price as it stands? Because, I mean, if you look at the buying that's coming out and you look at the amount of Bitcoin that is mined every single day, it seems like, with these treasury companies and these people buying, that Bitcoin should be taking off. And it normally does in October, November. This is the time, right? If you look at past cycles. But it seems like because Wall Street and BlackRock has been in, it's a little different this cycle. I know every cycle we say that as Bitcoiners, but are they manipulating the price in your opinion?
So they won't directly be manipulating the price in the way that people think, because BlackRock and those 800,000 Bitcoin are predominantly just ETFs held in custody at Coinbase. And Coinbase is another public company. So understanding that Coinbase doesn't do proof of reserve. So, but they do have public company disclosure. Is the regulatory environment sufficient enough right now to know whether they're utilizing those Bitcoin? Well, it's not just proof of reserves, it also is legal contracts that they can make on top. And so the problem with saying blockchain is the solution is it's not, because you can have blockchain and then legal shenanigans off chain on top through legal agreements. And so while it certainly helps. You can see whether the Bitcoin are moving. You don't know whether they're actually, engaging in a lending agreement like MF Global did. Everyone thought they had their commodities, but then they were engaging in creating additional commodities that didn't exist. And then farmers were wrecked in the agriculture industry because they were relying upon those hedges. So, do I believe that BlackRock is manipulating the price? I believe that the financial industrial complex is trying to accumulate as much Bitcoin as possible. And they would like your Bitcoin. And by levering up, I believe that influential hedge fund managers and various other covert currency wars are certainly being waged on Bitcoin. You won't know who the players are. You know that there's a little bit of plausible deniability there, and that's how they normally do these things. They'll take a hedge fund, and they'll do it via that. I think Cantor Fitzgerald is an important player in the network. I think and the problem is that many of these Bitcoin treasury companies are going into bed with SoftBank, Cantor Fitzgerald, even cypherpunk developers. Adam Back mentioned in the white paper, he's creating like these financial weapons of mass destruction, converting 30,000 Bitcoin into one of these vehicles, which means that he's going to end up working for Wall Street too. So we just need to be aware of these things. But is the price being manipulated? I believe short term, the price has always been manipulated. It used to be done by exchanges and market makers. Now it's being done by more sophisticated players. And that has never stopped and will never stop. Market short term will be manipulated in order to, and the insiders, I used to be a market maker on the London Stock Exchange. I left in about 2006. But our job was to manipulate markets to go the opposite of what the majority of people are doing. And it's the 5% or 1% of insiders that make all the money at the expense of the 95% that think they're going to be looking at candlestick charts and figure out how to beat the market. That's not how trading works. It is the insiders always win and they always accumulate more and more. They did it with gold, they'll do it with Bitcoin. And so they will always be able to manipulate short term price. So your job is to hack it by being a long term investor. If you try and short term trade, you'll lose. They'll take your Bitcoin. If you're a long term investor, allow them to manipulate, buy cheaper when they do, and you're fine. You'll be good.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, that's always the winning strategy. But you said a lot of interesting things there. I want to get into Cantor Fitzgerald and the potential connection with Tether in a little bit because I think that's very interesting. But I want to dive into more of banks because I think that, seeing with JP Morgan that you mentioned earlier, seeing Jamie Dimon essentially flip and be like, I was wrong about Bitcoin like less than a month ago now is really interesting to see his turn and then the lending on Bitcoin that now JP Morgan offers. But I think that another little wrinkle here that not a lot of people talk about is that Coinbase and Circle, one of the biggest stablecoin issuers in the United States, just had to file for banking charters. So it seems like now even the shitcoin casinos, that were once anti-bank, are now basically becoming banks in the United States. So what do you take of essentially this banking industry now starting to try to embrace Bitcoin and honestly start to try to push us more towards that stablecoin route?
Yeah, I should give a little bit of disclosure. So, in the early days of Bitcoin, I invested in about 100 different companies in the industry. One of those was Coinbase. Another one was Circle, which launched the USD stablecoin. Another was Bitfinex, that ended up the sister company to Tether. So, and Robinhood as well. So, all of those companies you just mentioned, I will disclose I am a shareholder. And, as they go public, I've been selling my shares because I don't want to be a part of companies that are now being consolidated into the proof of weapons network. I was there for them when we were on the Bitcoin mission, but as these companies go public, these become banks essentially. Once you do a public listing, you are either owned by the banks or you become a bank, and there's no exception to the rule. Or you get targeted by the bank and knocked off the network in a Chapter 11, in which case the private equity industry buys you in distress. So or the network always wins, and once you've gone to Silicon Valley and to Wall Street, there's no reversing that. And so, yeah, what the interesting thing is that banks are going to now be allowed. If you get, so let's look at a few things. The Genius Act. So we had the Biden administration, which was incredibly hostile, crashed the market. We had a bunch of fraudsters. We had a deliberate, coordinated operation to take out the crypto-friendly banks like Signature, Silvergate, Silicon Valley Bank, and some others. And then you had the BlackRock, the change of administration, the approval of the ETF. Then you had Trump administration, and Trump administration said we're going to do Bitcoin strategic reserves. And so far, he's only confiscated Bitcoins. And so, he just did another. I don't mean he. This is the bit that people get wrong. People think that CEOs are in charge of companies. CEOs work for their board and boards work for their shareholders. Shareholders are in charge. And I don't mean the retail shareholder, I mean the shareholders of the proof of weapons network. They think the presidents are in charge of countries. Presidents work for their lobbies, and their job is to take the money that they receive from lobby and put a narrative on top of it to make it look like the people's vote matters. So lobbies control politicians, executives work for the network, and they even create the dollar because they own the Federal Reserve.
Last bull run, we had exchanges blow up. You saw FTX, Celsius, BlockFi, you name it. But the true power of Bitcoin is getting it off an exchange into cold storage. This bull run, I'm trusting Trezor, the company that's been around for over a decade, and they just had a brand new release of the best hardware wallet in the game, the Trezor Safe 7. It's got the first audible secure element. No other hardware wallet has this. On top of it, I travel a lot, so I need an easy way to connect my Bitcoin hardware wallet to my laptop, phone, what have you. Therefore, it is the easiest way and has the best connectivity to access your Bitcoin. This is truly how you become your own bank, and the best way to do that is with the Trezor Safe 7. So you could go to the affiliate link down below and get yourself one right now, and do it quickly because they are flying off the shelves, folks. So do it with the easiest and best way to get your Bitcoin off exchanges. So go to the affiliate link down below, get yourself a Trezor Safe 7, and get your Bitcoin off exchanges in the easiest way possible. All right, enough from me. Let's get back to the show.
And they even create the dollar because they own the Federal Reserve. And so the board members of the Federal Reserve are just simply the shareholders of the banks. And so this whole network is centralized into financial control. And so, with the illusion of a democracy and some kind of capitalism, which is just not at all. Where was I going? I was talking about something before I went on that tangent. I said Trump. Okay, Trump implemented crypto friendly regulations, seized Bitcoin. That's all that's happened so far. But what was in Genius Act? Genius Act just focused on crypto. Crypto is a Silicon Valley psyop in order to pre-mine fiat currencies to end up with people's Bitcoin. They have nodes on the network that create all these different things, put a decentralization wrapper on it, create something like Terra Luna and say it's a decentralized stable coin. And then they're involved in manipulative operations, whether it be Sam Bankman-Fried, whether it be Alex Majinsky, whether it be any of these different people in the network. They go get some Silicon Valley money, they pre-mine a coin, and they go scam people. That's the crypto industry. Bitcoin is different because it was created in a different way. And so the crypto regulations, what has it done? Well, firstly, it took, because there is an operation, so we got the merging of two operations. One is to turn the dollar into a technocratic 1984 Orwellian nightmare, a privatized central bank digital currency with competing interests that can issue those stable coins. So Elon Musk, that's essentially building our social credit score, he gets a stable coin. Trump, through World Liberty Financial, he's managing the outflow of investments over to the Middle East from America. And so he issues his stable coin every time he's doing a deal with Abu Dhabi, sovereign wealth fund, to manage these capital outflows. You have all of these different types of transactions that are happening, but the idea was to have, we're the crypto capital while they build this surveillance state. And so stable coins, turning the dollar into programmable, has a couple of agendas it serves. Firstly, it allows the government to dump. If you look at who's buying all the government debt right now, 1.8 trillion of the auctions that are rolling over is owned by Cayman Island. Who's Cayman Island? BlackRock, all of the financial industrial complex managing your pension. So all the foreign countries are selling US government debt, and Cayman Islands is buying it. And so you've got nodes and countries on the network, but they're running out of buyers. And so stable coins via Cantor Fitzgerald, who's a primary dealer that is the buyer of last resort of treasuries, can dump a lot of these treasuries onto stable coins. Stable coins are going to be the American people. So what are they doing? They're taking the Federal Reserve is having a fight between Trump and Jerome Powell in order to manipulate the interest rates down to like a quarter of a percent. They want to do Trump wants to do a 300 basis point decrease. That's never happened in the history of the Federal Reserve. If he gets it, he's been installing patsies into the Fed. But who are the patsies he's installing? Well, Trump works for the bank. So everything goes back to the same network at the end of the day, but you have this illusion. Once you get interest rates down to a quarter of a percent, you can dump all of these treasuries and debt onto pensions and stable coins, and they pay the artificially low interest rates. The long term interest rate is going high. That's what determines mortgages, auto loans, credit cards. So the average person is struggling. They're moving to a 50-year mortgage in order to roll out their debt. They're begging for $2,000 in order to create more inflation. While Trump is pushing down the interest rates with the Federal Reserve so that you subsidize the cheap debt. And stablecoins is one vehicle for providing more liquidity to roll over the debt in this managed decline of the dollar. That money gets pumped into the stock market. So, again, wealth inequalities coming from that, and a bunch of it goes into Bitcoin. And then if people lever against it, they can take more and more of your Bitcoin. So the financial industrial complex is doing this elaborate thing. Now, what was in the Genius Act? The Genius Act and the Clarity Act, which is to come, it said that banks are able to use their reserves at the Federal Reserve as collateral for a stablecoin. So that's $3.2 trillion over to anyone that has a banking license. It also said if you are a bank, you get to offer yield on your stablecoin. So they can borrow from the Fed, at the quantitative easing artificially low rate, and then pay yield out to the investors to share that in order to take more of the market from the stablecoin issuers that aren't banks. So what you're doing is you're encouraging everyone to become a bank. And that leads to mergers and acquisitions. So the banks are just going to acquire as many stablecoin issuers. They're going to have the advantage, and they're going to use this to centralize programmable money, integrate it with the technical industrial complex, your social credit score. Also have your Palantir in there as well, and usher in the name of MAGA, we're winning, we're going to be doing it. They're giving as much Bitcoin to the financial industrial complex. And by the way, they're not America first. They're hosted on the America stock market, but these are global financial institutions. If they need to crash America, they'll crash America. If they need to asset strip America, they'll do it. Just look what they're doing in the UK. Don't give a shit about the UK people. They're destroying the country. Closed borders, open borders, asset stripping, creating religious tensions, creating racial tensions, and they're buying up all those assets on the cheap. They're buying the UK's water supply. They're buying the water. They're turning it into data centers. They're manipulating its energy prices. Like these people are collectively scalping and asset stripping the West for everything they can while they engineer this move. And stable coins are an essential part of it. So, this is why Bitcoin in self custody is the resistance. And no, America won't have Bitcoin strategic reserve. It will create the legislation to seize your Bitcoin if it wants. And that seizures, what happened to all the gold that they seized from the Americans in the 30s? America ain't got it. It's on the Federal Reserve balance sheet. The Federal Reserve created financial weapons of mass destruction by collateralizing the gold that was meant to be owned by Treasury. And that's why Trump's not doing an audit at the Fed, because the only time you do an audit is when you're ready to crash the dollar and show that that gold's not there. It's actually owned by the Fed, who is owned by the banks. And so, this is the type of sophisticated operations that America is doing to say we're the center of crypto.
Yeah, and I think from a timing perspective, it would take them like years probably to fully audit the gold in Fort Knox if they were actually going to do that. But I mean, there's a few questions I have off of that. One is, with the connection between Cantor Fitzgerald and Tether and the government. What role does Howard Lubnick and now Bo Hines going from basically creating the Genius Act to now being like CEO of USAT, the new USA stablecoin of Tether, as well as Howard Lubnick moving from Cantor Fitzgerald over. Was this all a part of the plan? Essentially, was getting these privatized industries basically under U.S. government control?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I think saying things are a part of the plan is a step too far because most people think of a conspiracy theory and an organized cabal. It's actually way more decentralized and way more chaotic and disorganized than that. What actually happens is there are financial weapons of mass destruction. The banks know how to use them, and they hedge and they get things wrong all the time. They don't win all the time. They get their operations wrong, but they know how to hedge for every eventuality, and their goal is to control as many of the levers of power as possible. And so by taking companies public, using financialization, securitization, and now tokenization, they'll use every weapon that they can in order to extract more assets from the people. And so Howard Lutnick is just one of those people in the network. You look at everyone around the Trump administration, you got Steve Witkoff, which is envoy to the Middle East. What's he doing? He's a shareholder in World Liberty Financial, which is issuing stable coins every time they do a deal with the Middle East, setting up funds, $2 billion funds funded by Saudi in order to actually geopolitically influence the situation, selling off American assets of AI, building data centers across the Middle East, and then saying that he's helping America. And who is his son? His son's part of World Liberty Financial. You got Steve Witkoff, you got Howard Lutnick. Howard Lutnick's son owns Cantor Fitzgerald now. And so Cantor Fitzgerald is doing the leverage part of it. They're custodying the stable coins. They're engaging in investment banking activities to take as many Bitcoin treasury companies public. And they're creating the loans to mine fiat currency by getting you to collateralize your Bitcoin. So they're essential in that network. You've also got Bo Hines, as you said. He's left, gone to Tether. Tether, Ripple Labs, Coinbase. What do they do? And they're part of the crypto lobby. This is a new emerging lobby. They paid for a percentage with the technical industrial complex of the White House ballroom. So by paying for the ballroom, they're leveraging their way in. And then suddenly Tether announced that, hey, the White House person, you're on our board. We're going to create a US version of Tether. And essentially, these are the backhanded deals in order to allow Tether to exist outside the US. It's very important to have separation, a US compliant version, which is the front company, and then you have the ability to exist outside the US, but you have to sign up to some Wall Street influence. They want some levers over to you. So you must custody your treasuries with Cantor Fitzgerald. And in Cantor Fitzgerald, if they want to wipe Tether off the network, they have leverage. They've signed up and joined the mafia. Same with people like Nakamoto, the Bitcoin treasury company. Same with Jack Dorsey. He's now in bed with the Japan Proof of Weapons Network via SoftBank, the American Proof of Weapons Network with the Fed and Howard Lutnick, and they're doing deals together. And so what you're seeing is there's a decentralized network where nobody has the full power.
This bull run, I'm looking for ways to stack Bitcoin in my sleep, and mining has always caught my eye. I've partnered with the guys over at Simple Mining to help you do just that. I don't recommend anything that I don't use personally, so I've got a machine up and running with them right this second. And they've even opened the facility up so anyone can go and visit. They manage over 15,000 machines for 500 clients, handling all of the maintenance and repairs so you don't have to. And for the Green Candle listeners, they're giving an exclusive offer. All the repairs for the first year for free. So if you've been thinking about mining, head on over to simplemining.io/greencandle to get this exclusive offer and learn about the potential tax benefits that you can get from mining with Simple Mining. All right, enough from me. Let's get back to the show.
You can't get out of the network. Once you join the mafia, you're in the mafia. So Tether is part of that network, and then they hedge. And when they want to take Tether off the network, they try and manipulate, legislation, lobby money, and at the worst, this network also has control of the quote unquote deep state. They own the military industrial complex that gets Pentagon budgets. The Pentagon budgets means they have access to the CIA. If the CIA wants to knock someone off the network, you can be blackmailed, you can be assassinated, you can be tarnished, you can be called all sorts of reputational things. And this is the network has these types of levers. So as soon as a company goes public, goes Silicon Valley, joins crypto VCs, does stable coins under the legislation, creates a bank, gets that license, they're in the network and they are no longer on our side. Whether they're good people, this is not a judgment character. This is how the network gets you. And it is us versus them. That is what Bitcoin was designed for. It was us versus them. They are all a part of that network. And your job is to own Bitcoin in self custody, eventually run a node, and get ready for the battle ahead because we're going to win.
Amen to that. Yeah, I definitely think we are going to win. But obviously there's going to be some temptation, I guess, here in the short term because of all these players coming in. Now, what do you take of Jamie Dimon and JP Morgan's role in all of this, especially, as they've essentially done this flip that I mentioned a little bit earlier, because, I think it's really unique. We're seeing the banking industry now trying to, get into the stable coin aspect of it. So, you mentioned a little bit earlier about the new banking issuance where they could essentially use the Federal Reserve in order to issue these stable coins. Do you think that that's going to be the case where every bank now has their own stable coin, or are they going to try to keep it in privatized companies? How do you see this overall, I guess, working? And you mentioned the UK here earlier. I don't think a lot of people are talking about the US and the UK recently making this partnership to collaborate on overlooking and, essentially just monitoring the crypto industry is what they're calling it. And obviously the craziness going on in the UK, if you want a free and open state in America, it would be the exact opposite what's going on in the UK. So working together would just be a complete lunacy and would just be a complete opposite of what the United States allegedly stands for with all this. So what do you take of that partnership on top of how the banks are starting to play with these stable coins?
Okay, let me take that as two separate questions. If I forget the second, I get a bit excited sometimes and forget my trail of thought. So I'll come back to UK if I forget to do it. Let's start with JP Morgan. So JP Morgan's places a very special role. The creature from Jekyll Island, the Jeffrey Epstein's banker. This is a deep state actor, financialization, securitization, deep relationship with the military industrial complex, deep state. This is top of the power structure when it comes to financialization and securitization. But it is a public company. Although it has a lot of off balance sheet black op operations, the ones that make it to the balance sheet that has the share price, its number one shareholders are BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. So while it has significant power, it is also really subordinate to the main asset management power structure. And so Jamie Dimon is just an executive. Executive's an important executive, but he works for a power structure, which is his board and shareholders. And so when Jamie Dimon says something, if he's saying the wrong thing, he'll get the memo coming down from the agenda of the higher powers that be. The top of the network, BlackRock, wants Bitcoin and securitization tokenization. And so BlackRock, Larry Fink, can push down to JP Morgan, while JP Morgan and Larry Fink are in a bit of a power struggle. They have the same shareholders. And so the shareholders can dictate. So if Jamie Dimon's job is to go out there and say crypto's a scam, Bitcoin's a scam, he was doing that throughout the takedown phase. He was also doing it during the distressed acquisition phase when Celsius was blowing up and FTX was blowing up. And it was doing it during the ETF phase. That gave BlackRock the maximum volume so that JP Morgan didn't become the number one ETF issuer or anything like that. So there is a hierarchy in terms of who gets the assets first. BlackRock was meant to be the number one liquidity provider. Remember, BlackRock in the 2008 financial crisis was the contractor to the Federal Reserve when determining which companies go bust and which companies survive. JP Morgan was borrowing right up from the Federal Reserve using Aladdin and BlackRock's consultations, and they took out the ETF department of Barclays. That's that UK relationship going on, and they ended up with all the ETFs that Barclays iShares had, which gave them all of this ETF power that they're now using in order to get all of these board seats and various other things and get to the $12 trillion of assets. So JP Morgan and BlackRock are two of the most important nodes on the structure. I do believe that that JP Morgan is the chosen one to do the covert central bank digital currency. So they'll be building out the rails to make Americans think, oh, those Europeans, they're all communists, they're all like crazy, they're all lefty radicals, transgenders, and LGBTQs, and rainbow fairies, and warriors for climate change, and they're destroying their economy. When the reality is they're owned by the same network. So what the network does is it creates competing ideologies. Europe, which is European Union and ECB, are a part of. It was a creation of the Bank for International Settlements. The Bank for International Settlements is where all the central banks are shareholders, and the Federal Reserve is the most important node with the proxy vote. So, Bank for International Settlements can say, ECB, you're going to be a central bank digital currency. You're going to be the socialism narrative, and America, you're gonna be privatized, same model, but through stable coins. Why? Because the Federal Reserve is the only central bank owned by the banks. All of the
Yeah.
other central banks are shareholders in the Bank for International Settlements, but they're owned by the government infrastructure. So the central bank in all the other central banks
Shit.
is a mechanism for controlling the government. And their job is to print as much money and bankrupt governments and send that money back up via NATO into the US stock market. And so you have to push out narratives to strategically weaken, and then you force your policy because you own all the companies and the stocks, and you make Europe look like they're some crazy communist country when really it's just the network controlling both sides of the narrative. They've done this historically time and time again. Wall Street funded both. They created the Federal Reserve, the creature from Jekyll Island. JP Morgan was a part of that power structure. They also funded the Bolshevik Revolution that led to the overthrow of the Russian Tsar into Soviet Union and communism. They also funded Nazi fascist Germany and the Hitler regime through the Bank for International Settlements when the Reichsbank, who was the governor of the Reichsbank, the Warburg brothers, who was also governor of the Federal Reserve. So what they've got a history of doing is they create fake capitalism, which is bankrupt the US government with $38 trillion of debt over the last 100 years. And take the other sides of the ideology. So they benefited from communism, they benefited from fascism, and they created fake capitalism in America, which was a debt based Ponzi scheme, which is the US dollar, to bankrupt the US government and turn it into fascism again, which is where America's headed to. Europe is headed for more closer to communism, but controlled by private interests. America's going to an Orwellian technocracy surveillance state with fascism, and then they're partnering with the other countries they don't control, which is the Gulf countries, BRICS, China, Russia, various other countries. And so that is where the network is. And JP Morgan is an essential part of transitioning to that multipolar world. We covered the UK side. The UK is just a patsy to the proof of weapons network, as is the US. But the US has a different thing. It hosts the most liquid capital markets, and the banks are allowed to create the dollar. So they're going to weaponize liquid capital markets and the dollar for as long as they can, but they're acquiring the UK, they're acquiring Australia, they're acquiring Canada, they're acquiring the European Union. These are constructs for having full command and control to the proof of weapons network. And so that's what these operations are. So when you see the European Union is going to be a central bank digital currency, America will be stable coins issued by the proof of weapons network, and UK gets to keep the probably either do a digital pound or they're going to do some kind of I think they'll probably go to digital pound and CBDC model, but they're all serving the same network and the same agenda.
Why would you ever hold generational wealth on a piece of paper? It doesn't make sense. You need a foolproof solution, and I've got it for you. You could get this as low as $25, and if you use promo code Green Candle, you could get 10% off. Being around for 12 years, they've engineered the perfect and most easy to use solution. I've partnered with CryptoSteel to offer you guys just that. It is the cheapest and most secure way to store your seed phrase. I don't know about you guys, but I don't have too many things where I think 1 ton is going to fall on this, but it could survive all of that and more. So go to cryptosteel.com. You can use promo code GreenCandle. You can get 10% off your entire order if you go there today. So go ahead and protect your generational wealth and do it with CryptoSteel. All right, enough from me. Back to the show. Now, I think that this is really interesting. What do you make of like these limits that they're putting on already? Are they, I mean, they're essentially just not even trying to hide it anymore. I believe the Bank of England just said that they're going to put these limits on their CBDC that they're going to issue, or the digital pound that they're going to issue, to just 20,000. I was going to say $20,000, but 20,000 pounds, obviously. And it seems like, there's all these limits that they're issuing up with these CBDCs already. So they're essentially saying the quiet parts out loud, and it doesn't seem like anybody's rebelling, except for when it comes to the digital IDs in the UK. They're putting limits at like 20,000 pounds. And, they're already talking about these social credit scores. I mean, Christine Lagarde even compared their CBDC rollout to the digital euro rollout to what they're seeing in China. So they're essentially saying the quiet parts out loud at this point, and it doesn't even seem like they're trying to hide it anymore.
Yeah, so the model is normally is you have an unelected European Union whose job is to create a narrative for the European Central Bank to print money, and then that money goes back into US contractors to prop up the US stock market and prop up the euro dollar. And the same in the Middle East, you have the same with the petrodollar, which is interestingly working in reverse right now. But that's the euro, that's the Anglo-American, and European Union. It all goes through together. What they typically do is the narrative around central bank digital currencies in the West started with the Bank of England. And then they had the Enbridge project, which was to go integrate into the Bank for International Settlements. And then you have the regulations that come from the Financial Action Task Force. The Financial Action Task Force is kind of a subset of the International Monetary Fund and the Bank for International Settlements. Both of those are US controlled by proxy. And so the US gets to determine what happens to Europe and UK via these proxy networks. And so what they do is they beta test the UK, scale it on Europe, and then implement it in US, but the privatized version, because the America is all about stealing assets from the Americans and consolidating them over to the proof of weapons network. So they always do the privatized version in America, and then the experiment with the digital ID, the central bank digital currencies, the narratives, the immigration crisis, all the divide and conquer operations, civil unrest, all the things they do in UK. Then they scale it in Europe, and then they bring it to America, but where it all goes up to the privatized interests in the US stock market.
Now, it seems like there's a lot of, potential manipulation points for all of this. Now, I want to revert back to something that you brought up earlier when it comes to a lot of the financialization of Bitcoin. We've seen a lot of these derivative products, options, all of these different things start to come to Bitcoin to try to treat it like an asset. Now, that obviously brings a lot of centralization. Is that just kind of the ruse of this whole thing, is just to create these financialized products in order to, allow you to put more Bitcoin into their custody so they can take it? Or is there just, am I maybe reading too much into this?
No, Wall Street only cares about one thing: profits. They want to financialize and securitize and now tokenize absolutely everything. They want it to be trading 24/7, and they want hedge funds to manipulate prices, private equity to acquire in distress, investment banks to create the product, asset managers to buy the products, and then the private banks to create the fiat currency. Now they want the central bank, sorry, the stable coins and the CBDCs, so that they can have the integration with the technical industrial complex. The technical industrial complex needs digital ID, social credit scores, and then you have financial institutions on both sides, the banking side and the alternative side. All of these are part of the same network hedging, and then you get to manipulate the price via the hedge funds. You also get to create the derivative products, which are the financial weapons of mass destruction. The goal is to make you trade as much as possible, pay as much interest as possible for leverage, put as much as your Bitcoin in their custody, charge custody fees, to create products, financialize, securitize, roll it over, turn it into a credit default swap, create a collateralized debt obligation, create a collateralized Bitcoin obligation, slice it up, tokenize it, wrap it, put it into a mortgage product, anything to make you exchange your Bitcoin in self custody for fiat currency loan and debt enslavement. And they want your Bitcoin in custody so that when they want to change the levers of power, boom, they can manipulate prices, margin call you, and get as much Bitcoin in their custody for as much fees as they can. And that's their game. Their game is simply one thing: they have a quarterly annual report and they need to produce profits. They have the off balance sheet illegal operations and they have the on balance sheet legal operations. They need to siphon as much money through the illegal ops onto the legal ops, and then every quarter, people will say to them, "Are you making us more money or less money? Are you accumulating more assets or less assets?" And their job is to create financial weapons of mass destruction to meet that goal, so that shareholders still buy their shares. And that's it. They only care about profits. They don't care about you. They don't care about their customers. They don't care if they kill people. They don't care about wars. They don't care about anything. There is no ethics. There is no morality. There is no humanity. There is no sustainability. If your country is no longer useful for them, they'll wipe your country out, acquire it, and move on to the next country. If you're not having children and your birth rates are down, they'll just go over to Africa that's still having children and decide to create peace there, as long as they can own as much of the infrastructure and the resources as possible. If you are no longer useful as humans, they'll make sure they got artificial intelligence and robotics so that they can manage it. And when you can no longer do anything, they want to manage your benefits, put you on a universal basic income, and they will do whatever is required to meet the bottom line, because their God and their worship is money and money alone.
Now, I love that rant, and I agree with you 100%. But it leads me to that question: not only Wall Street, but where does the government come into this? Because they've just been essentially seizing Bitcoin, and the last seizure I thought was really interesting because it was like, a Chinese citizen, I believe, who got arrested in the UK, and then now all of a sudden, somehow, some way, the United States was able to get this Bitcoin and add it to its strategic reserve. So it seemed like it went through little leaps and bounds in order to get into the United States custody. But it leaves the question. I mean, we've seen the United States seize gold previously. Is there a thought that they could essentially either seize from the citizens Bitcoin, or they could even purchase part of a company? I mean, we've seen them already try to buy some of Intel. Like, would they buy 10-20% of MicroStrategy? Then all of a sudden, that Bitcoin that MSTR has been buying is now under for the Bitcoin strategic reserve.
Yeah, so people have to rethink what governments are. People think their vote matters and that they work for the American people for an America First agenda. That's not correct. They are money laundering organizations to justify to the people why they should keep voting left and right and be distracted thinking that their vote matters, when there is one uni-party agenda, which is that of its lobbies. And the lobbies is the financial industrial complex and the proof of weapons network. And so governments are just tools to seize assets, create laws that help the network, rage wars and create narratives. That's all governments are. Their job is to do one thing and one thing only: take on debt and allow the banks to print more money, and keep rolling over the Ponzi scheme. That's all their job is. That's the only thing Trump is there to do. That he is there to roll over the debt and figure out how to get someone to buy those bonds. That is Scott Bessent's job. He's a debt dealer. That is all his job is. It's not to help the Americans. If you want to push them out to 50-year mortgages and then whatever it may be. Um, and so, that's what governments are for. So they don't want the government to have the Bitcoin. They want the Bitcoin. And so if the government can seize Bitcoins, then they want to keep it on that balance sheet, get it maybe the only Bitcoin strategic reserve you'll get is not buying them, it will be confiscating them. And so it's slightly different from the gold story. Let's go back to the gold story and then compare it to the Bitcoin story. So you had an over leveraging, you had the Federal Reserve, 1913, the roaring 20s. Everybody was buying stocks. You had a dot com boom and bust, but the equivalent industrial revolution version, in the 20s after the World War, leading into World War II. And they were pumping up levered stocks like crazy. It was like the AI bubble that we're experiencing right now. Everyone was saying this technology is going to change the world. I want my shares. I want to borrow against my house. I want to do everything. They were creating levered up financial weapons of mass destruction. And then they crashed the market. Then we had massive cascading liquidations, and they consolidated power, and acquired many of the cheap assets. Now the government started going deeper into debt. We then go into, we then go into a Great Depression. They will outweigh. They will out. They have the ability to last longer than you do. They can handle these Great Depressions. They don't care. And so then Roosevelt comes along and says, let's make gold ownership illegal. Because of all the wars and the debt, people were exchanging at that time their dollars for gold. And so they decided we got all of the British colonial gold, we got the Russian Soviet Union Tsar gold, we got the German Nazi Germany gold, we got 75% of all the gold in Fort Knox, and we got our manufacturing base and our military industrial complex. We need to build our economy on war and manufacturing. And so this was the construct of that. So what did they need to do? They needed to confiscate all of the gold from the American people in order to replenish those supplies and build the military industrial complex and build the post World War II Bretton Woods system. And that was get the world addicted to dollar debt and persuade everyone to stop converting their currencies to gold and just convert their currencies to dollars. And then they would do that. So they confiscated the gold from the American people by executive order. And then that all ended up in Fort Knox. But it was to replenish the gold reserves leading into World War II to build the military industrial complex, the IMF, the World Bank, and the post World War II Bretton Woods dollar standard. Obviously, they defaulted in 71 after the Vietnamese War. And then we entered into the fiat standard that we have today, where there's no convertibility into gold. It's just a question of who will buy the bonds. Now, that was needed as a tool to replenish gold reserves, to keep the gold window open and to manipulate the price at the time. Now, let's bring it back to where we are now. Bitcoin is not, there's no convertibility of the dollar into Bitcoin. There is no Bitcoin backing. So it's a slightly different thing. It's not like the government needs it. Also, remember the military industrial complex and the government were aligned previously. Now we've got an a national proof of weapons network power structure that has no affiliation with America. China could become the next empire and they're just as good as if America continues to dominate. It doesn't matter to them. They're hedged in every version. In fact, if there's less profits in America, then they'll reset the world order and move to multipolarity. And so, do they want the government to own Bitcoin? No, they're not saving the dollar. They don't want to strengthen the dollar. Backing the dollar by Bitcoin or by building Bitcoin strategic reserves could increase their balance sheet. They would much rather just use the government to confiscate, and then use their own market manipulations to end up with gold direct. So they want you to own your Bitcoin but then they want you to put it in one of their financial weapons of mass destruction rather than protect the government and protect the dollar. They have no interest in doing that at this stage. They're engineering a strategic weakening of the dollar right now to push those capital outflows and to break the petrodollar.
Now, what role does the BRICS nations then and the petrodollar kind of play in this? Because it seems like it's a bunch of countries that kind of hate each other, but all want to keep the control at a certain point. So, what role does the potential of, this BRICS currency that they've been using for international trade? Allegedly, Russia was using Bitcoin to get around sanctions. Like, how much weight do you take into that when it comes to the proof of weapons network?
Yeah, so BRICS aligned around one mission: de-dollarization. There was a covert operation to try and fool BRICS into creating a unified currency, but they dropped that project because that was a mechanism to turn BRICS into the European Union. A single unified currency is how you attack the economies and end up controlling the network through currency wars. And so they didn't launch their single unified currency. They were going to back it by gold. They looked at distributed ledger technology. They realized that everyone could mine some tokens every time they contributed some gold and did a resource trade. But then they realized, how are you going to create decentralized storage of gold? They said everyone would be incentivized to default. So that project, it was called Units at the time. They never launched, and I think it was the right thing to do. But what they did do is political and economic unification around de dollarization. And so what they essentially did is China, because it had the manufacturing base, because it had the rare earth minerals, by building up Africa when the IMF was destroying Africa, by building up the global south when the IMF was destroying the global south, and because Saudi and the Gulf countries all built their sovereign wealth based upon the petrodollar, they realized you know that China was the rising power. America became oil independent. What did that mean? Oh, the petrodollar's dead because America started competing with the Gulf countries to export oil and gas. And so they pushed the Ukraine war in order to destroy Europe, make sure that Russia could no longer import its gas, and force Europe onto expensive oil and expensive gas provided by America, and started competing with the Gulf countries. So the Gulf country where it said, well, where's all my money going to come from? Oh, it's China. Who's buying our oil? Well, Iran is selling its oil and gas to China. Russia is selling its oil and gas to China. Saudi is selling its oil and gas to China. Qatar is selling its oil and gas to China. And then what are they doing with that money? They're buying the US. So Trump's going around saying, oh, we've got $17 trillion of investments coming in. They're buying OpenAI. They're buying X. They're buying all of the stocks. They're buying all of the equity based assets and selling the debt based assets. They're no longer buying treasuries. Instead, they're buying equity. So the money's coming from China, and the Gulf countries are buying America and buying Europe. They're putting Europe into distress to acquire them on the cheap. And then America is selling the pristine assets to the Gulf countries. And so now Nvidia is building in the Middle East. Nvidia is the data centers are going into the Middle East. Why? They got access to the energy and resources. And so what China said is, let's create an allegiance. They want to weaken Europe. Well, let the CIA do their covert operations, and you sell your gas and oil to us. We'll buy it. We'll keep up the operation, and we'll prove that sanctions no longer work. We'll also de-dollarize and create a network of transactions that all exist outside the system, but we won't do a single unified currency. And so that's what they did, and now they're acquiring the US via the Gulf countries. The Gulf countries are sitting in the middle. And what did BRICS do? BRICS said, led by China, China said, you know what? Let's end the forever war in the Middle East. Iran and Israel, you're a puppet for the military industrial complex. You pretending that you're about to create nuclear and scaring the American people. We made $10 trillion from the American people over to the American companies as a result of those fake forever wars and the fake war on terror. And you were funding all of the groups, ISIS and Al Qaeda and all these different groups. And everyone knows that they were CIA operations now. The jig is up, you know. And so now let's end the forever war and negotiate with the banks on regional stability, artificial intelligence, data centers, access to cheap energy. And so they said, Iran, Saudi Arabia, stop being enemies. If you want me to buy your oil, then you're going to get on. And so Iran and Saudi Arabia normalized. It was brokered by China. They announced it, and that killed the petrodollar. And now essentially Israel is being dumped because they were the country for the military industrial complex to create forever wars, agitate the region, ensure that they would never unify around their oil resources, and eliminate all the competition. So now the GCC is saying, right, let's turn Israel into a toxic asset. The military escalated and allowed the events to happen that we've seen over the last 2 years. And now, essentially, you've got a unification between regional blocks: BRICS, GCC, SCO, ASEAN, and they all unified around making sure they could de dollarize. Who did they need in order to execute that vision? Remember, this had already been determined during the Biden administration and prior to that. This has been a 10-year operation, knowing where America was going in its degeneracy, in terms of its excess valuations, in terms of its drug addictions, homelessness, civil unrest, everything that was happening across the West. And so they basically said, let's put Trump in, tariff policy, let's reset the world order. Let's acquire all of the small businesses in America because they're going to pay the tariff income. Let's acquire all of the export dependent countries that will go distress as a result of this and their companies. And let's push the whole world closer to China. And then Trump can say, we're making America great again and building our manufacturing base. But what is he actually doing? He's building AI in an Orwellian, central bank stablecoin social credit score, while the Americans think that this is about making America great again. And so, and again, this isn't Trump derangement syndrome. This is Biden derangement syndrome, Obama derangement syndrome, Clinton derangement syndrome, and Trump derangement syndrome. This is a well orchestrated uni-party operation. And now we're moving the world to multipolarity. We should be happy with that. There will be less death, less destruction, less wars, but the West will be decline, and the global South will be able to use their resources, and China will be the manufacturing base, and then there will be a global surveillance state. You escape it by boycotting the system, owning Bitcoin in self custody, and becoming sovereign yourself, and stop pretending that politicians give a shit about you because they are rug pulling you and giving you narratives and lying to you about what they're doing.
Yeah, so it seems like no matter which party wins at this point, it's all, I mean, not a part of the plan, but essentially it's, this proof of weapons network. It's going to reign, I guess, victorious over this government and centralized entity. So the only
It
solution
already
is
is.
just to
It already is victorious. The government's working for the people. That ended decades ago. They financialized, securitized, tokenized, and controlled the Democrats, the Republicans, the Labor, the Conservatives, every party, the opposition, Mandani, anyone. They're part of that. They control all of these different nodes. They're all prostitutes for narratives.
So then why sell us the narrative that Trump is going to, do you think like the American people have essentially maybe part of this Bitcoin revolution? Why sell us on, hey, Trump is going to be this anti government type of figure to come in, and Trump is going to be this guy that is essentially just defeating all of these narratives when it comes to the overall government, and those narratives being, hey, the government isn't really working for you. He's going to be a man of the people and all of this. So why sell us on this that Trump is anti-government in order to kind of continue this facade along?
Because the goal of the network is to continue the facade that you are invested in
Gosh.
believing that democracy exists and your vote matters. Your vote doesn't matter. Your money matters. The only way to control the network is to impact their share price and to activate and boycott the network. The only way to combat the Fed is to own your Bitcoin. The only way to combat BlackRock is to own it in self custody rather than an ETF. The only way to combat the banks is to not borrow against your Bitcoin. The only way to combat the global multinational institutions is to spend local and boycott the large organizations wherever you can. But what do they need you? They need you invested in the belief that you're winning. But every time the same thing happens, and you're like, oh, we got Trump, we saved the world from communism, and you end up with what we've got. And then Mondani comes along, and the left and the Democrats get to say, yes, we took on the system. And then the Republicans get to say, everybody need leave New York. They know that New York was going to be destroyed, but now they get to say it's because it was Mondani and it was a Muslim takeover and it was the communists and the Democrats and the lefty radicals. And so they execute the vision and they give you a narrative. As soon as you cheer on, yes, we got Trump, you've bought into another 2 years of believing that something will change. And then you go to the midterm elections. When you get to the midterm elections, the Democrats say, hey, we're gaining power, we're gaining something. And then they start to think they've got victorious. We got Mondani and he's going to look after us. And now they've bought in, and then you've bought into fighting against the Democrats, and that carries on as a merry-go-round of distraction to make you think that the middle management, the only reason my life is fucked right now is because of you, Trump, or the only reason that I had to leave New York is because of you, Mondani. These are customer service. They're customer service, they're middle management for a greater power structure, and they want you to believe that it's communism and capitalism, and the Republicans are the capitalists, and the Democrats are the communists and the socialists. And meanwhile, this is controlled by banks. It's a financial, oligarchy, and it is consolidating power. And the longer you buy into the system, the longer you will be a debt slave to the system. You have to opt out. You have to beat BlackRock. You have to own assets, and you have to sell the ideology that they're feeding you. Because as long as you believe the lie, you won't take the actions that you need to take in order to protect yourself. It's all a lie. I'm sorry to give you the red pill, but the red pill, the antidote to the red pill is the orange pill when you understand how the world really works and you're no longer a useful idiot for all the wars, death, and destruction that the military industrial complex and the financial industrial complex are creating in order to prop up your dollar, which is create this K-shaped economy which is extracting more and more resources from the average American and sending them into this nightmare and believing that their system is better than everyone else and saying, hey, it's the Europeans, they control everything. It's the banks at the Europeans. It's the communist. It's the Chinese communists. It's all narrative lies in order to justify and hide from you how the proof of weapons network really works.
Wow, this was an incredible situation or incredible conversation, and it seems like the only solution to all of this is just Bitcoin and self custody. So that's our revolution right there. So I absolutely love you breaking this down all with you, Simon. I'm gonna have you on in a few months again to keep on this conversation, but I'm gonna leave some more to chew for the next conversation. But Simon, why don't you tell people where they can find out more about you and see more of your work, because I'm subscribed to this newsletter now, man, and it's outstanding. So why don't you tell people about that?
Yeah, sure. Bitcoin has blessed me. I live in the Bitcoin and self custody world, and
Oh
I
no.
want people to have a simple solution because complexity is the enemy. And I want people to have a simple solution. And I've been saying this same thing for 14 years, ever since Bitcoin was $3, and I documented the whole journey on my YouTube channel from speaking at the first Bitcoin conference to today. And every single week, I go live for this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, this week in geopolitics. And all I do is follow the money every single week and show you how what they're saying is completely opposite to where their money's going. And so when you follow the money, you start to notice these patterns. It's a journey, it takes time. So I publish that on my YouTube channel, Simon Dixon. I back that up on my blog, simondixon.com, and I give live on X regularly, so you can follow me on at Simon Dixon Twit. So I'm easy to find, but the antidote is absolutely Bitcoin in self custody. Own more Bitcoin this month than last month. Do that for a minimum of 4 years. Avoid shitcoinery. Avoid leverage wherever you can. And after 4 years, come back to me and say, do I really? Would I have done better if I had bought shitcoins? Would I have done better if I was trading and using leverage? Would I have done better if I bought Nvidia? Would I have done better if I did any of those things? Every single person that I've put this challenge to, they come back to me in 4 years and they ignored price and they beat the proof of weapons network. And some of those are billionaires, millionaires, and they've changed their life completely. And anybody can do that. Spend less than you earn, save the difference in Bitcoin, own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month, learn how to self custody it, and do that every month for 4 years. And then come back to me on X and tell me whether I was an idiot for asking you to do it.
Yeah, I don't think you will be. So I'll put all that in the show notes. So Simon, thank you so much for your time. You've been very generous, and this was an absolute firecracker of a conversation. So I can't wait to put it out. So Simon, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys all for tuning in to another great episode of the State of Bitcoin podcast. If you found some value in this one, please hit that subscribe button and that like button to help send this one to the masses. And I've got a surprise for you guys. I've got 2 more episodes that you have the chance to watch here. So go ahead and click one of them, and I'll see you guys all at the next one.